Welcome back to this Edexcel GCSE History Summer 2023 feedback event. In part one, we looked at entry data, grade boundaries and grade statistics, and also we looked at the issues that arose in this summer's medicine and Germany papers. Now we're going to be looking at some exemplar student responses along with senior examiner feedback. We'll start with paper one, the thematic study in historic environment. Now this slide gives some general feedback on paper one overall. Many students responded well to the examination papers this summer and were clearly well prepared. The third bullet point at the bottom of the screen reinforces the importance of chronology and the sense of distinct periods for the thematic study. Because the thematic study focuses on change over time, it's essential that students have a good understanding of the chronology, and they also need to be familiar with the dates and the names given to specific time periods in the specification. Students also need a clear understanding of the key themes and also the factors involved in change. These are identified in the process of change box, which can be found at the top of the specification content for each option. So the first question in this paper is the describe two features question. To get full marks, students need to identify a valid feature and then provide some supporting information. And obviously they need to do this twice to get 4 out of 4. Now there's an example on screen of one feature which scored 2 marks. You can see underlined in blue, the student has identified a valid feature. And then the second sentence in orange, the student provides some supporting information. A good tip for students to remember is to try to write 2 separate sentences to make it really clear to the examiner what feature is being identified and what the supporting information is. Sometimes students can blur this by only writing 1 sentence, and it's hard to identify the second mark. In terms of room for improvement on this question, we often see students giving very generic responses which don't relate to the specific focus of the question, and these can't be rewarded. This is an example of a response which was felt to be too vague and didn't focus sufficiently on transporting soldiers away from the battlefield. On the flip side, we also see some very knowledgeable students who just write too much here and use up valuable time. The example on the previous slide is a good one for showing how much students need to write to get full marks on this question. We also just wanted to flag that the Whitechapel question on the growth of socialism wasn't well answered this summer compared to the other 3 options. We are currently reviewing how this question performs to see if there's a way of making it a little bit more consistent. We do award each option separately though, so if a question is challenging, this can be taken into account when setting grade boundaries. Moving on to the source utility question. We always get lots of questions from teachers about how to approach source utility, so this slide aims to clarify our required approach. Students only need to deal with one relevant aspect of provenance: nature, origin, or purpose. They do not need to deal with all 3 in their response. Students must comment on the source content, consider one relevant aspect of provenance, and use one linked aspect of relevant contextual knowledge. They need to make a judgment on how useful the source is for the specific inquiry, making clear the criteria for their judgment, then move on to the next source. Comparison between the sources is simply not required. The strongest responses will link an appropriate aspect of provenance and own knowledge to evaluate source content, rather than focus on extensive discussion of source content or adopting a generic nature, origin, purpose checklist type approach. Comments which focus on limitations of source content in terms of completeness are often invalid because no source can include everything. Such an approach is only valid if it is something the author has intentionally omitted. To be clear, it is okay for students to consider the limitations of the source, but it's not a requirement, and if they do consider limitations, they just need to be careful they don't fall into this trap of saying it doesn't include this and it doesn't include that. Since they only need to make one inference about the content, it may be better if they focus on what makes the source useful for a specific inquiry. They can also consider the limitations when it comes to the provenance of the source or use their contextual knowledge to say, for example, how typical the source is. We're now going to look at some examples of source utility responses. Many students understand how to approach this question, and examiners saw some excellent responses. Now, this slide considers some of the qualities of high-level responses. The third bullet point on the screen considers the type of criteria students can apply when making judgments on how useful the sources are. For example, this could be based on the accuracy of the source, its reliability, any limitations, knowledge of the author, special insights, or valuable information provided by the sources. We're now going to look at some exemplar responses from crime and the historic environment on Whitechapel. The question asked students how useful the sources were for an inquiry into conditions in Whitechapel which affected policing, and we're going to be focusing on source B, which you can see on screen. Okay, so this is an example of a level 3 response. The student clearly focuses on the inquiry about how conditions in Whitechapel affected policing. Underlined in orange, you can see how the student assessed the usefulness of the source content. Then in green, you can see where they take into account the provenance of the source by considering its nature. The section underlined in blue is where they use their own knowledge. And finally in red, you can see a clear judgment about the usefulness of the source for this specific inquiry. In terms of room for improvement on source utility questions, this slide identifies the need for learners to try and include contextual knowledge in their responses. Examiners saw some very good answers to source utility questions this summer, but they couldn't access the higher marks because they didn't include any contextual knowledge. If students deal effectively with the source content and the provenance of the source, but their answer lacks contextual knowledge, then the maximum mark they can get is mid-level 2 for that source. And just to clarify how they should be using that contextual knowledge, it needs to be relevant to the specific inquiry, and students need to use it to assess the source. For example, to add detail about something mentioned in the source, to add weight to an aspect of the provenance, to place the source in broader context, or to assess whether the source gives an accurate view or showed a typical situation. Now, we're now going to look at an example of a typical level 2 source utility response, which fails to use any contextual knowledge. So as I mentioned, this is an example of a level 2 response to the same inquiry question on Whitechapel. Note the lack of contextual knowledge, which limits it to level 2. At the start of the response, there's an unsupported judgment on how useful the source is. This is underlined in red. Then in the next part, the student simply repeats the source provenance, and obviously this can't be rewarded. The student does make a valid comment about the purpose of the source, shown here in orange, and they make a valid inference about the content, underlined in blue. But the lack of contextual knowledge limits the response to level 2. Now, we don't have time to look at all the paper 1 question types, so this slide explains where you can find more guidance on questions that appear in the thematic study part of the paper, including the principal examiner reports and the Summer 22 pre-recorded feedback. Moving on, we're now going to consider the paper 2 British depth study. This slide gives a summary of the different question types in paper 2B. Question 1A is a key features question, which is identical to the one in the historic environment. Question 1B is an explain why question focused on causation, and we'll look at that in more detail when we get on to paper 3. Question 1C is a judgment essay where students have to identify the second order concept. Students have a choice of question here. And we're now going to focus on the judgment essay and look at some of the qualities of high-level responses. Now, the judgment essays are worth 16 marks, and the mark scheme takes a similar approach to the 12-mark causation question. The first 2 bullet points are identical across the levels, but each level has an additional bullet point evaluation strand to reward the judgment that students make. So effectively, there are an extra 4 marks in this question for evaluation. The most successful students on this question develop a line of argument that runs through the essay with evaluation sustained throughout. So they're weighing up the different factors as they go along, rather than it just being at the end in a conclusion. We're now going to look at an example of a high-level 4 response from Henry VIII, and it's in response to the question you can see on screen. Now, because the judgment essays tend to be fairly long, we couldn't fit the whole essay on, so these are just extracts from the student's response. The full version can be found in the Henry VIII Principal Examiners Report, which is on our website. We just wanted to focus in on some of the key parts of the essay to highlight the qualities of a level 4 response. Now, it's clear from these extracts that this student is demonstrating some excellent knowledge and understanding of the period. You can see in this section they've focused on enclosures and the Eltham ordinances. We've underlined parts of the essay where the student is weighing up the impact of each reform in each paragraph. In the second part of the essay, the student considers a third aspect of content, the justice system, and again, underlined at the end of that paragraph, you can see them weighing up the impact of this reform. And then finally, they provide a conclusion which contains a clear judgment based on valid criteria, in this case, the breadth of impact of each reform. We're now going to look at an example of an essay from Elizabethan England, which scored a mid-level 2. The extract is in response to the following question on screen. So this is an example of a mid-level 2 response. For AO1 knowledge and understanding, the student goes beyond the stimulus by talking about Drake, navigational instruments, and bigger boats. This is an example of a student demonstrating some own knowledge, not good own knowledge, which makes it a level 2 for AO1. There is some attempt at analysis, and the student does make a judgment, but it is insecure. So overall, the response was judged to be in level 2 for both strands of the mark scheme. Okay, so moving on to the second section of paper 2 and the period study. Now, many teachers feel that the period study is the most challenging paper. If you refer back to the table we showed earlier, which ranked questions by mean mark, you'll see that the period study questions are all towards the bottom of the table, which supports this. We have got a pre-recorded training event on the period study questions on our website, and you can access this link via the PDF of these slides, which are on our website. The first question in the period study is the explain two consequences question. To do well in this question, students need to explain two distinct consequences for AO2 and support their explanation with good knowledge and understanding of the period AO1. The mark scheme is shown on screen. Now, it's important to note here that students aren't demonstrating AO2 by simply describing a consequence. They have to actually explain how the consequence happened as a result of the given event or development. And we're going to look at an example to explain this on the next slide. So this is an example of a high level 2 response from British America. The question asks students to explain two consequences of the Enlightenment for British America. If you look at the first example on the left of the screen here, the student states that one consequence of the Enlightenment was that it led to independence. They then explain this by saying the ideas from the Enlightenment led to people being much more likely to oppose the British, and then they add specific information by referring to Thomas Paine. Overall, this response scored 7 out of 8 marks. The second consequence demonstrates slightly stronger AO1. In terms of room for improvement on this consequences question, some students simply repeated the same consequence with slightly different wording. Some students were able to explain valid consequences, but did not support that with good knowledge and understanding, so remained in low level 2. And once again, we had some very knowledgeable students writing far too much on this question, which meant they lost valuable exam time to answer questions 2 and 3. Okay, so now let's look at a level 1 response to the consequences question to see where there's room for improvement. This is a response to the American West question, asking for 2 consequences of new technology for farmers in the American West. For consequence 1, the candidate has provided a simple comment about it being easier to treat their land, making the answer level 1. For consequence 2, the candidate has a simple statement of consequence about saving a lot of time, but lacks knowledge, making it bottom of level 1. Better responses to this question explained the problems farmers were facing and how the advances in technology helped them, and they were able to identify specific examples such as barbed wire. The next question in the period study is the analytical narrative, which is the one that a lot of students find challenging. This question requires a very different approach. Students need to link developments and events together to show a clear sequence which is supported by good knowledge and understanding. It's pleasing to see that many teachers have taken on board our feedback from earlier exam series about the approach required for this question. And as you can see in the table on screen here, the mean mark has increased year on year since 2018, and also the percentage of students getting into level 3 has also increased each year, which is fantastic to see. We're now going to look at some exemplar responses to show the approach required by this question type. And to start with, we'll look at a high level 3 response to this question from superpower relations. Okay, so this response has a clear beginning, middle, and end. They effectively use the stimulus points to frame their response. You can see underlined in blue here at the top, they start off with the Yalta Conference. For AO2, there's a clear narrative giving a coherent and logical sequence of events leading to a conclusion. Notice how the student links the events and developments with the terms underlined in red. For example, this led to, the arms race began, it was compounded, it highlighted, etc. This is the second part of the student's response. Again, there are some excellent links underlined in red. Now, this is clearly a high level 3 response. In terms of room for improvement on this question, some responses focused excessively on material outside of the time frame of the question. This is a big challenge for students because they want to set up a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, and they need to try and make sure they start at an appropriate place in the chronology, which means they can focus on the period in the question. It's important to have a good understanding of the chronology so you can get the dates and events in the correct order. Another area to focus on is trying to get students to link events to create a sense of an overarching narrative, rather than simply writing 2 or 3 descriptive paragraphs which don't link together properly. And finally, students must avoid telling a first-person story approach. This is not what we're looking for in this question. The next example we're going to look at is a low level 2 response to the American West analytical narrative question this summer. Okay, so this is the complete response we can see on screen. The student hasn't written much, but it was judged to be low level 2. As you can see underlined in red, there are some sequencing of events. Due to increasing demand, this led to, etc. And underlined in blue, you can see the student has demonstrated some knowledge and understanding for AO1. And we've provided the mark scheme below this response so that you can see how the level 2 level descriptors match the qualities of this response. The final question type in the period study is the importance of X for Y question. Here, answers which only explain the general consequences or importance of the event X without explaining its impact on Y are unlikely to reach high level 3. We're going to look at an example of a level 3 response from the Cold War question below. So this response demonstrates level 3 for AO2, as it explains the importance of X, Soviet relations with Cuba, for Y, tensions between East and West. This is the second part of the response. As you can see, performance in AO1 is relatively weak, level 2, so the overall best fit mark is low level 3. Lower level responses to this question tended to provide a narrative account of events in Cuba and weren't explicit about how the relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union increased tensions between East and West. Moving on to paper 3 and the modern depth study. This summer, examiners found that many students were very well prepared for their paper 3 option and had a clear understanding of the demands of all the various question types. Question 1 is the source inference question, and this performed very well this summer. Most students understand that an inference needs to go beyond the source content, not just repeating the content. Students also understand that the inferences must be based on the source provided and not from their own knowledge, as AO1 is not assessed here. On screen, we have an example of a source inference question from Weimar Nazi Germany, which scored full marks. As you can see, the student makes 2 valid inferences from the source and supports them with specific reference to details in the source. In terms of room for improvement on this question, one common reason for students failing to score highly is when they simply repeat the source content rather than making a source inference. And there's an example on screen here from the USA topic where the student does this. Another common issue is where students make a good inference, but it can't be rewarded because it is not related to the specific inquiry focus. And as mentioned earlier, students who make an inference based on their knowledge, which can't be supported by the source, is also a common issue. Question 2 on paper 3 is the explain why question. Now, most students are very familiar with how to approach this question type. In the mark scheme, the first bullet point in each level relates to AO2 analysis. Although the 2 assessment objectives are equally weighted, the focus of the analysis AO2 is considered first. Successful responses displayed knowledge and understanding AO1 that was relevant and at level 4 was precisely selected to support their analysis. We're now going to look at an example of a high level 4 response to an explain why question from Mao's China, and this question scored full marks. And it's in response to the question on screen. We've provided the whole response on screen. This is the first and second part of the essay, which deals with pinyin and university admissions. Underlined in orange, you can see how the student provides excellent analytical explanation, which is directed at the conceptual focus of the question. And this is the third section of the essay, which looks at the economy. The student has provided accurate and relevant information throughout, which is precisely selected for the question. This is clearly a high level 4 response. In terms of room for improvement on this question type, one area that means students fail to score highly is where they provide a narrative of events or a descriptive account which lacks the AO2 focus on explaining causation. Some students miss the focus of the question or write outside of the date range. And as I mentioned earlier, the Germany explain why question did not perform well this year, with an average mark of 4.4 compared to an overall average of 5.7 since 2018. So we need to understand why this happened as part of our review. We're now going to look at an example of a high level 2 response to an explain why question from Germany. It's in response to the question on screen. Okay, so these extracts are typical of a borderline level 2, level 3 response. The student shows some knowledge and understanding for AO1, which is level 2. It's not good knowledge. There is some analysis, which attempts to engage with the second order concept, but it is not strong, which makes it borderline level 2, level 3. This is the third section of the response, which focuses on the Munich Putsch. The student deals with 3 aspects of content, so they can reach the top of level 2. And this exemplar is at the top of level 2, scoring 6 marks. We're now going to focus on the questions which relate to the sources and interpretations. Question 3A is source utility, which we've already looked at in paper 1. Question 3b, how interpretations differ. Students seem really very confident in answering this question and it performs well. So we want to focus in on question 3c, why interpretations differ. We want to clarify exactly what is required with this question. The mark scheme always provides 3 examples of different ways this question could be answered, but students only need to use one of these examples. The question states, you may use sources B and C to help explain your answer, and this is probably the most straightforward way of answering this question. Students who do well with this approach often simply state that one reason why the interpretations differ is because the historians use different sources to help form their views. These students often then use the 2 sources provided, which give different views on the issue, to explain the differences in interpretation. Now, do not overcomplicate this question. Students do not need to worry about the provenance of the interpretations. Knowledge of the provenance, such as the publication's date or the author's nationality, or whether it's a book or a website, is simply not required in the specification. This is an example of a response which scored full marks, which uses the sources to explain why the interpretations differ. We've not provided the sources and interpretations, but just focus on the technique the student uses. The student says that one reason why the interpretations may differ is that the historians use different sources. They then go on to link specific detail from each source to each interpretation, and that is all that is required in this question. Moving on to question 3D, which is the culmination of the inquiry package on paper 3. Having worked with the sources and interpretations for parts A to C, students are then asked how far they agree with interpretation 2, and in doing so, they're directed to make use of both interpretations as well as their knowledge of the historical context. Students should remember that this question is about whether they think the historian who produced interpretation 2 got it right. Students are not expected to evaluate the interpretations for reliability or utility, and they're not being asked to offer their own views on the question in the inquiry. The emphasis should be on analysing the views in the interpretations. There should be references to each interpretation, and contextual knowledge should be integrated into their evaluation of the interpretations rather than being offered as information. High-level answers typically have the following features. They focus on analyzing and assessing the interpretations. They cover both interpretations. They integrate contextual knowledge into the evaluation. They develop a line of reasoning that runs within the answer. The judgment is consistent with the comments in the answer, and the judgment is justified. High-level responses often start with a clear judgment and rationale. This is an extract from a high-level 4 response found in the Germany Principal Examiners Report. The best answers also show how the authors of the interpretations have created different views. This could be through use of language, tone, emphasis, selection of details, etc. For example, interpretation 2 gives a positive view of Stalin, stating that he was a clever politician. The author Walsh emphasizes how smart Stalin was, using words like extremely. However, interpretation 1 only gives views on Trotsky's weaknesses. And at the bottom of the screen, we can see an extract from a student's response in the Principal Examiner's Report from America this summer. Here, the student refers to how the differences of view have been conveyed when discussing the exaggeration of the interpretation. And in terms of room for improvement on question 3D, common limitations that result in a lower level answer include answers which offer the candidate's own view in response to the inquiry, answers which focus on one interpretation rather than analysing both, answers which simply identify valid points in each interpretation in turn, answers which treat the interpretations as sources to be evaluated for reliability or utility, and answers which do not include contextual knowledge or which do not link contextual knowledge to an evaluation of the interpretations. Another issue on question 3D is where students simply offer an explanation of the different views with acknowledgement that each had some valid points by saying things like, I partially agree with interpretation 2, and I also agree with interpretation 1. These answers are unlikely to reach the higher levels of the mark scheme because there's little sense of evaluation and they're simply offering an explanation of the different views. Okay, so that concludes our look at exemplar student responses with examiner comments. There are many more exemplar student responses in the principal examiner's reports which can be found on our website. We're now going to look at some upcoming training and support. In the first section of this training event, I talked about how we were carrying out a review of our assessments, and we'll update you on the outcomes of this review later in the autumn term. We're currently developing ideas for more GCSE and A-level history training events for 2024, and more information will be available about these later this term. Following the positive feedback received about our GCSE History Knowledge Booster tests, we're now working on some new medicine knowledge boosters, and they'll be released towards the end of the autumn term. We'll also continue to develop our Key Stage 3 History Topic of the Month resources, and we're going to be starting to publish new worksheets and posters each month. Upcoming topics include Licorice of Winchester and the Bristol Bus Boycott. Just a quick reminder about the GCSE History language amendments which we've recently announced. We recently reviewed our GCSE History specification for sensitivity of language and identified a number of terms, such as Plains Indians, which are now considered outdated and problematic. We've therefore decided to update some of the language in our specification. The changes come into effect for first teaching September 2023, first assessment summer 25. And the options most affected are the period study options P1 to P3. A new version of the specification, issue 4, is now available on our website, along with specific details of the changes. You can also find detailed FAQs and a rationale for each change on the link above. The focus has been on language changes only. There have been no content changes. Now, obviously, we do recognise that some students will need a bit of time to get up to speed with one or two of the language changes. And to support students, we will provide a transition period where we will gloss the term Indigenous peoples in live exams from summer 2025 to the remainder of the current specification. The publishers will also be updating their textbooks in due course to reflect these changes. Okay, so that's the end of this pre-recorded GCSE History Summer 23 feedback session. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions about our specification or assessment, you can email me at teachinghistory@pearson.com. Look out for more training events via our Professional Development Academy. The link is on screen.